Here's all council present, jury, and also present. Good afternoon. Ms. Silverman, you may continue.
Thank you. Welcome back. So again, when we left off at lunch, I had just spoken about the elements of murder, and we talked about malice that can be express or implied. I went through an example of implied, and that in this case you have a clear intentional killing, so you have evidence of an express malice with intent that preceded the act, because obviously when we're talking about a conspiracy, we're talking about planning. I am obviously, as I said earlier, not going to go over every piece of evidence in this case, but I am going to give you examples of things that you can look for. That doesn't mean that when you go back in the jury room that you might not come up with numerous examples of your own from the evidence that I've gone through, but one of the examples obviously is the defendant writing Mrs. Baker on that mirror in June of 2016. Also, as I mentioned, and we're going to talk about a little more detail, sending the secret information for the home surveillance cameras to Baker. I talked about that this morning, but what I did not mention, and you can see it here in the slide, not only does the defendant send that email to Robert Baker, but if you recall the testimony of Officer Curtis Davis, she then engages in more consciousness of guilt evidence, because what does she do? She deletes the email that she sends to Baker. So again, they're constantly using various forms of communication that they then destroy. Similar to what we're going to talk about when we get to post-arrest conduct within the jail and the extensive evidence that was brought out by Detective Mitzi Roberts with respect to using various schemes to communicate, again, secretly and destroying that evidence. She also, we know, had to have shared the location of that DVR, and I'm going to get into the evidence that proves that, because as you also heard, it was, I think it was Detective Gable testified that Baker was 5'7", and you saw the height of that cabinet just outside the door leading from the kitchen into the garage on the left. So if you were going in from the garage, it'd be on your right, and that you have this cabinet that's about, I don't know, looks to be a person. You saw a picture of detectives there in the crime scene photos. It's clearly over 6 feet tall, and we'll talk about the description of the DVR box, that's a slimline DVR box, the new DVR. And it's on top of this cabinet, and we'll talk a little bit about how it's, as Detective Gable said, it wasn't in plain view. Someone would have to point it out to you, and there was that moment of testimony where defense counsel, if you remember, Miss Delia Rivera Pacheco, when she came in to testify, who used to be the housekeeper for the Sementillis that came every 2 weeks, defense counsel tried to get her to say, oh yeah,
Your Honor, that's improper.
It's overruled.
the DVR box, and he showed her a picture of the garage, remember, with the cabinet, and she's looking at the photograph, and she has no idea what he's talking about, because as she testified, she knew that there was one day where, when she was in the house, Monica had said something to her about, oh, something's wrong with one of the cameras, I'm going to go in the garage and fix it. But Delia, she has no idea where that box is. And she's at the house, cleaning the house every 2 weeks, and has no idea that that box was, prior to the murder, kept on top of that tall cabinet in the garage. We'll talk more about that. You also heard, again, from Detective Mitzi Roberts about the 180 Viber communications with Baker on January 22nd of 2017, and I am going to spend some time on January 22nd because that's a critical date, and you have an exhibit of those communications that was created as a summary from the Viber records that is in evidence for you. Also, we heard that on that same date of January 22nd, while Baker is waiting at the strip mall ahead of time, because he's already been told by the defendant 2.5 hours prior to Fabio going out there, he has, after a phone call from the defendant, there are then, when he gets out to that location, as you heard from Cy Ray testify, that there were 69 Viber communications going back and forth between the defendant and Baker just while Baker was waiting in that back parking lot behind the strip mall. You also have the evidence that on, as I said, January 22nd, the defendant sends Fabio out to that strip mall location, the same location that she gave Baker, so that he would know where to be ready and waiting. So if you think about the type of place that they were going to pick up from that night. Remember the testimony of Robert Baker where he said, well, I knew the family only used 2 different locations that they ever picked up Chinese from, and I knew one was a Thai place. Well, that's not Chinese, it's Thai. And the other one was pho, which some people might think it's Chinese, but it's not, it's Vietnamese. So even in his own testimony, he just kept doubling down on his lies and dug himself into not just a hole, but a grave. And so we heard that testimony as well, that he just coincidentally, on his own, figures out which of those 2 places Fabio's going to be at, and then sits there and waits for Fabio before Fabio even knows himself that he's going to be going out to pick up pho that night. So either Baker's lying, another series of incredible coincidences, or Baker had some sort of crystal ball because he knows what Fabio is going to be doing before Fabio even knows. So that's the kind of evidence that I'm talking about. And you can see from what I'm describing, you could go on and on and on through the evidence in this case. I'm just pulling out certain pieces that show you intent to kill or express malice aforethought. And there's more. There's also the 95 Viber communications between the defendant and Baker on January 23rd. Now note that it's less communications than the day prior, but what do we know about January 22nd? Well, we know January 22nd was a Sunday, right? And so we also heard the defendant's home that day, and we hear that because Ernie Valorano, if you recall, comes over to the house that day. He and Fabio take a ride in the Porsche. They're trying to get the Porsche fixed. He's leaving to go out of town the next day with his wife, and he doesn't learn about the murder until he lands, I think, in London. And so that day, the defendant has more free time, right? Because Fabio's out of the house and he's in the garage. You heard about this very odd exchange that occurred between Fabio and Monica that Sunday that Ernie was a little bit uncomfortable with. It wasn't the norm. But on the 23rd, which is a Monday, we have less communications. But what do we know about Monday? We know that she actually is with Baker for part of that day, right? She starts calling him at 6:50 in the morning. They start vibering each other. It's vibers, we're going to use it as a verb in this case. And she meets him at LA Fitness, right? And they're there for, I think she's there for a little bit under, I think it's like 54 minutes, a little bit under an hour, where she's there with Jessica. When supposedly the defendant works out with Jessica, is on the treadmill, and somehow Jessica missed a portion of that short time period where the defendant went and played racquetball with Baker. This injury occurs, and he bleeds all over. We know that's a bunch of hooey. I don't know how to spell that. But then again, she doesn't need to be vibering so often with Baker because, as I said, they're together for a period of time. She goes home, and then she starts communicating with Baker again the minute that they're out of eyesight of each other. And then what does she do? She goes and she meets him at Target. Okay? So we know that they're together for a portion of that time, and the only time they're not communicating via Viber is during the time periods when they're together, either at LA Fitness or at the Target lot, and then only one time during that window, suddenly, when we know this murder is going down, where the defendant sends a message, I believe it was to Baker, I believe it was at 4:46, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So, again, we know that she has this secret meetup in the Target parking lot. Now, why do I call it a secret meetup? Because they were so secretive about it, right? It's, as Deborah Obad would call, shady behavior. The defendant, she contacts Baker, she knows he's in the Target lot, they're vibering, she communicates with him up until the point where she's taking that right off of the, I think it's Winnetka, into the parking lot, or Ventura into the parking lot, and then we see that she goes and does this weird thing where she stops at the area right in front of where the Payless store would be on the left. So when she comes in from Ventura, she takes a right, she then makes a left, she stops in front of the Payless, as I said, and we know Baker's still in the lot. And this winds up being this whole back and forth where we're fighting all about, like, could Baker still be in the lot? Is he not in the lot? Maybe he's not in the lot. How would we know that they met up? The phone records put them there. Cyril told you they're both in the lot at the same time. And then Baker gets on the stand and says, yes, so I met her at the Target. So we know also from looking at the video that when she comes in, Baker has now reparked the rental car, the Versa, at the back of the lot where Detective Roberts told you she went out and she looked at that little alcove area, she saw photos of it, and that there's a way that you can go around into that back shopping center and it brings you out of view of the camera. Why would anybody do that if you're not trying to hide? And if they're not trying to hide, when the defendant comes into the lot and stops, and as Detective Gable and Detective Roberts told you, you can see the figure and you can watch it back as many times as you want. That someone comes in and appears to get into the front passenger seat, the defendant then parks to the back of the lot. And I think it's a little over 4 minutes. And they have some communication, and I'm going to tell you what I believe happened during that 4-minute period in a little bit. And then Baker gets out, he goes back to his car, all of a sudden you see the Versa, he's pulling out of the lot to go pick up Austin, or as he testified to, Austin was hiding in the car. And then the defendant goes and parks her car close to the front of the store and goes into the Target to create her alibi, as we also heard about from Austin. So that's why I refer to it as secretive behavior, consciousness of guilt. And at this point, we know that she has communications with Jessica to don't be late for babysitting. And Jessica's response isn't just, thanks, it's LOL, laugh out loud. Okay. And so she leaves. The defendant checks the IDMS app to make sure she leaves. And then we know that she lies, and we'll talk about this at some point later, numerous times to law enforcement about various things to cover up the murder and what she did on that day. She also makes numerous admissions, and as I said, the court is going to instruct you on the difference between confessions and admissions, and statements by a defendant are generally considered admissions. So you're going to hear instruction on that, and if you recall, we had the evidence that there were numerous statements after the arrest that she makes while she's communicating with Baker, both in the back of the black and white vehicle on June 14th, when they are whispering to each other, and we heard about the failed attempt by the detectives to have redundancy in terms of the recording devices in the vehicle, and then again when she's in the cell with the Perkins agent, and then the spontaneous statements that she makes to explain away the DNA to Detective Gable. So there's all of that. So again, I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the evidence in this case, and obviously there's a lot more than that, and you'll hear more as I go through today, but feel free to make note of whatever rings a bell with you. So now, I've talked about murder, and when we talk about murder, murder in general is murder of the second degree, unless there's something in addition that causes the murder to be a first-degree murder, elevates it up to the level of first-degree murder. And in this case, the judge is going to instruct you on two different theories of first-degree murder. One is willful, deliberate, premeditated murder. I think that's the one most people think of when they think of first-degree murder. Oh, it's a willful, deliberate, premeditated murder, and I'm going to go through it. The other is murder by means of lying in wait. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, when we look at the things, the type of evidence that support a willful, deliberate, premeditated first-degree murder, they're the same kind of things that we're going to talk about when we get to conspiracy. Because again, when you're talking about a conspiracy to commit a crime, there's planning, there's deliberation and premeditation. So a lot of the evidence that supports both counts 1 and 2 are the same. In addition to that, when I talk about first-degree murder, the second theory of first-degree murder, murder by means of lying in wait, I am also going to get to one of the special circumstances in this case that also is based on similar evidence, and that is the special circumstance allegation of lying in wait. So there's a theory of first-degree murder by means of lying in wait, but there's also a special circumstance if you meet the elements for lying in wait. They are two different paths to first-degree murder. The interesting thing is, let's say half of you think, I think it's a willful, deliberate, premeditated murder. The other half of you say, I don't think so. I think it's a murder by means of lying in wait. The law says you don't have to be unanimous as to which theory of murder you base your decision on, as long as all 12 of you agree that at least one applies. So as long as you all agree it's a first-degree murder, how you get there, what path you choose, doesn't matter. For instance, there's a couple different ways I can come from my house in the morning and get to the Hall of Justice, my office across the street. Either of those ways will get me there. Which one I choose doesn't matter as long as I get there. I hope that makes sense. So you're going to see an instruction the court's going to give you. It's going to read it to you, and it's going to talk about the fact that you do not have to be unanimous as to which theory of first-degree murder applies, as long as you all agree at least one does. I am going to argue to you they both apply. And it is entirely reasonable that the 12 of you, and you never know when you are up, because you've seen what's happened throughout this trial, you might all say, I think it's both. All 12 of you. Doesn't matter. When you get to the verdict forms, you're going to see the forms will be separated. There will be one for guilt and one for not guilty for the two crimes. Crime number 1, murder, which we've talked about. Crime number 2, I'm going to talk about in a minute, conspiracy to commit murder. When we talk about murder, there will be a place on the form that you will have to fill in as to whether or not it's murder in the first degree. It will not necessarily indicate, I haven't looked at the forms yet the way they are, but it will not you might not have to put in, I don't believe you're going to have to put in which theory. It's only going to ask you whether or not you all agree it's murder in the first degree. But the judge is going to instruct you on both of these theories because both of them are supported by the evidence in this case. I hope that makes sense. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk about each of them. 2 theories of first-degree murder. I'm going to, as I said, they both apply here. I'm going to talk about the evidence that supports both of them. First one, willful, deliberate, and premeditated murder. What does that mean? Well, willful, again, just like we were talking about the definition of murder, intentional murder, it's the plain meaning. Deliberate, you're going to hear from the instruction that deliberate means that you got there or is formed based on the careful thought and weighing of the considerations for and against a particular course of action. Now, I want to tell you that when we talk about deliberation, the law does not say that means you have to sit down and take a sheet of paper and make a pros and cons form and make a line down the middle and write all, this is the pros, this is the cons. That's not what we're talking about. But there has to be some consideration, some thought that goes into this. And we know there was an awful lot of thought because I'm going to talk about the fact that they had been planning this for quite some time. And we're going to talk about the July 2016 Las Vegas trip, as well as the spike in communications that Detective Roberts talked about, which is represented in another exhibit between the dates of January 11th and January 13th of 2017, when there are communications going back and forth between the defendant on her mobile phone, on her house phone, to Baker, and then he is communicating with Austin, and back and forth. And then in the middle of those 3 days, lo and behold, Austin, with money provided by Baker, purchases his airline ticket to LAX to commit this crime 2 weeks out on the 23rd. So, deliberate means, as I said, there has to be some thought that goes into it, because obviously they even thought about and talked about, as we heard from Austin and from Baker, about how to commit the murder. Gun would be too noisy. We talked about stabbing and how that's such a up-close personal way to commit this kind of a crime. Obviously, if you thought of, let's say, strangulation, you're talking about a guy like Fabio, he's a big guy, that's going to be tough, especially given the amount of time that would take. So they're thinking about how to do it. Baker tells you about how he bought various knives, that he brought a particular knife with him to Las Vegas to show it to Austin to gauge his reaction, and all of this. So again, planning, and they're weighing out how they're going to do it. Premeditated means it's considered beforehand. And as you're going to hear from the law that Judge Cohen's going to read to you, no exact measure of time is required. So the law, as I said, doesn't require someone to sit down and write up this pros and cons form or sit for a period of time and think about it. The test under the law is not the duration of time, it's not the amount of time, but it's the extent of the reflection, which in this case is enormous, given the planning behavior. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about motive again here. And as I told you earlier, you're going to have instructions on motive, the existence of motive, or the lack thereof. In this case, we have a lot of evidence of motive. As I mentioned earlier, we have this obsessive nature of this particular intense affair. We're not just talking about maybe a fling. We're talking about an intense affair that's continued for over a year, where they have engaged in this alternate lifestyle that we heard about with the swinging, totally different, and obviously appealing to the defendant than being a wife and mother. And we heard about the fact that they were making future plans to be together. We talked about the mirror. We also, if you had any question about whether or not the defendant wrote that in lipstick in November of 2016 on Baker's mirror, we presented to you several jail kites letters that she sent to Baker that were found in Baker's cell, where she signed the jail letters the same way: Mrs. Baker, Mrs. Monica Baker, MB, all of that. So we know, obviously, that that is her writing and her future intent. We heard about Sheila Salehian testifying that the defendant and Baker often talked about making plans to be together in the future because they loved each other and wanted to be together, and that the defendant was unhappy in her marriage. One of the other instructions that you're going to get from Judge Cohen relates not just to admissions, but to what's often referred to as adoptive admissions under the law. And adoptive admissions are when you are in a situation where someone says something, and it would be the type of situation where typically one would respond if it wasn't true, but instead you remain silent. So you were adopting. In other words, the fact that Baker says things to people in front of Monica and she goes along with it, like the time when the defendant and Baker go to Vegas for the first time, and Baker introduces them to Ron and Michelle Ray. And after they have this lunch at, I think it was a P.F. Chang, Ron said to the defendant, "What's your last name?" And he's putting her contact info into his phone. And he said that the defendant and Baker both looked at each other, and Baker responded, "Just put Baker," and the defendant said something about her name being long or complicated or something like that. So that's an example of what we're talking about. We also heard that Ron Ray testified that Baker came to Las Vegas. If you remember, Baker stayed again, although this was never brought out during the 12-13 interviews he had with the defense, but he stayed at various locations, various people's homes after the murder while he was waiting to see if the police would be coming for him. And he had the defendant communicating regularly with LAPD, asking about DNA results and things like that, because obviously Baker knows he's cut himself, and they've discussed this. And she wants to make sure there's no evidence that can point to Baker, because if Baker gets arrested, that just ruins their entire plan for this entire crime. So if you recall, when Baker comes to Las Vegas, he initially comes out at the beginning of February when the defendant goes to Toronto for the funeral services the first week in February of 2017. Baker goes to Al Birdsong's in Las Vegas, and he stays there for a period of time before he comes back. And that's after he's already been at various other locations. He comes back, and sometime around Valentine's Day, remember Roger Brown said he came over and said, "Oh, I'm gonna stay with you and make sure you're okay." But obviously Baker's doing it so that Baker's okay. So Ron says that Baker says that he and Monica are going to be living together soon, and that they're already making plans to move in together, and that was already in progress. And that's at the beginning of February. Then both Baker and the defendant come back to Vegas, as we heard, in March of 2017, when they meet up there, and they, for the first time with the Rays, and the defendant reiterates exactly what Baker had said from the month before, that they're planning on moving in together soon, that she's going to sell her big expensive house in the Los Angeles area, and that she's going to buy a place in Las Vegas for Rob, and she's going to come and go, and they're going to travel to Italy and all these other things. So we know that they're already talking about their future plans, and Fabio's body is barely cold, and the defendant is acting as if she has a lot of money, and she's picking up bills and things like that for everybody, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a little bit, but when we get to the special circumstance. But remember again, we're talking about the defendant who, other than the money that she's taking in from this app that Fabio created, Scissor Boy, that she's taking in as her business and writing off, she doesn't really have another source of income other than Fabio. And then Baker, when he started telling you about how he was living off all the money that he had from his porno days or his management days, when I started showing him the bank accounts, he was very shocked to see his balances. So again, there's obviously been a communication between the defendant and Baker regarding the money that's coming, because that's the money that's going to fund their lifestyle. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, we talked about the two ways to get to first-degree murder, the first being the willful, deliberate, premeditated avenue, and I just explained that. And the second is by means of lying in wait. So what are the elements of first-degree murder by means of lying in wait? And what you're going to see in a couple minutes is that the instructions and the evidence are going to be very similar to the special circumstance allegation. So, first-degree murder by means of lying in wait is generally characterized by a surprise attack, one would say, on an unsuspecting victim from a position of advantage. And what it requires is there has to be a period of watching and waiting for an opportune time to act. So let's start with that element, watching and waiting. So number one, we have on the 23rd, Baker and Austin are waiting around for Monica to give them the signal that Fabio is alone. Okay? We also have more watching and waiting. If you remember Austin testifying, and Baker actually as well, that when they got to the house, Austin said, per Baker, Monica said he's out on the patio, right? And so they're sneaking through the house. Whether you believe they came in through the front door, whether that she left unlocked, or whether she left the slider unlocked, doesn't really matter. They are sneaking through the house. Remember, Baker kept going over how he was so careful about entering because he wanted to make sure, bless you, that he didn't tip anybody off. I also want to point out something else that I don't believe is in my outline, but I remember thinking about it during the trial. Remember that when the defendant comes back from LA Fitness on the 23rd with Jessica, Fabio and Jessica are in the kitchen, and she is doing something in the living room, and she also mentions this later in the interviews with law enforcement. I think she might have said she was folding laundry or something of that nature and watching television and on her phone, and the television is on. Now, Fabio is working from home that day. He's not sitting in the house. He's in the kitchen. He's out on the patio. He's making business calls. He's back in the kitchen. He's on his laptop. And he's going back and forth. And when the defendant leaves to go meet Baker, at the Target parking lot, which is only 3 minutes, a little over 3 minutes away, she leaves the TV on. Why does she leave the TV on? There's no one sitting in the living room. Delia, Miss Pacheco, she's there, she's cleaning, she's going to get her stuff done, her family's going to come pick her up, she's leaving. Jessica is leaving to babysit. The only reason the TV is left on is to cover any sound that might be made by Baker and Austin coming into the house. Because Baker and Austin are going to have to come into the home very carefully so as not to tip off Fabio. Because even though they've been told he's sitting on the patio, you heard about the fact that they parked the Versa down a ways from the house and then jog up to the house. And so there's no way of knowing that Fabio isn't going to go into the kitchen to get something to drink or go in and open up his laptop. So there is, again, another period of watching and waiting as Baker and Austin come into the home to scout out exactly where Fabio is. And of course, he's still out in his home office on the back patio. And you remember that whole portion of testimony that went on indeterminately where Baker was talking about how he was waiting to see if Fabio could come in, and he didn't. And so that's when I brought up to him, because of course they never asked him, why is the power turned off? Remember when Detective Verna talked about going out to the crime scene and several of the levers in the power box just, again, next to that tall cabinet right outside the kitchen door in the garage? Why are several levers of the power turned off such that you had to pull on the emergency release for the garage door? Remember we got DNA, touch DNA from Baker's hands off that emergency release that was hanging down inside the garage? Why did you turn off the power? Because then you'd have to pull on the emergency release to get the Porsche out. And he said, oh, I did that because I was trying to lure him inside. Remember that? I don't know if he turned off the power because he was going to yank the DVR out of the wall up there on top of the cabinet. There's some things in this case we're never going to know, right? We get some more details filled in by Austin, but there's some details in this case we're just never going to know. Because, again, how do you take anything from Baker's mouth to heart without having it corroborated by independent evidence? You can't. So, again, there's this period of watching and waiting, even once they get to the house, for the opportune time for he and Austin to rush out and subdue Fabio, who's much bigger and weighs much more than Baker. So that's going to take two. Then, the second element of murder by means of lying in wait, there has to be concealment. Now, when we talk about concealment, concealment by ambush or secret design, the instruction says it's not necessarily concealment of your person, but concealment of your purpose or your secret design. So again, if you think about the defendant where she's watching and waiting for the opportune time, and we heard that things went sideways the day before because Austin got cold feet at the strip mall. Now they're on to the 23rd trying to find an opportune time, and they have to sort of fit this in on that day. We are never going to know why Fabio wasn't at his colonoscopy appointment, what caused him to cancel, or if that wasn't really true, but somehow he is persuaded by the defendant, obviously, to stay home. And so there is concealment by ambush or secret design in order to take him by surprise. So again, if you think about a surprise attack where you're concealing your true purpose, that's what the law speaks to, and you're going to hear instructions on this as the second theory of first-degree murder. So, again, we know the defendant is the one that has to set this up. There's no way Baker is going to be doing that. He needs inside information in order to get this job done. And so, of course, Fabio has no clue, no idea of what the defendant has been plotting with Baker, and that this is going to wind up being his last day on earth. And again, if you're talking about a situation where someone has a brief affair or a fling and cheats on their spouse and then realizes, I'm not going to destroy my whole life for this, that is not the type of affair that we have in this case. We have an obsessive love affair where this defendant is willing to blow up everything to be with Robert Baker. And so in order to get there, she has to lie in wait for the opportune time, just like we talked about. This would also apply to what they did on the day prior, on the 22nd, where she has to come up with an opportune time to send Fabio somewhere because they are going to ambush him and kill him in this shopping center, in this strip mall, when he goes out to pick up food the night before on Sunday night. So, again, what the law says and what Judge Cohen's going to read to you is that when it comes to lying in wait as a means of first-degree murder, just as we talked about with respect to premeditation, it's not about an exact period of time or the duration of time, and that's what the law says again with respect to lying in wait. There's no time requirement, provided that the duration of whatever time is spent is a state of mind equivalent, and look at this, we're going back to what I just talked about. Like I said, there's a lot of overlap to premeditation or deliberation, okay? So we're talking about the fact that there is planning, that there is a thought process that goes on, and that this is considered, obviously, before they kill Fabio Sementilli. Very similar. So, again, with respect to lying in wait as a first-degree murder, concealment of purpose and a surprise attack. That is the hallmark of a lying in wait murder. Also, again, just as I mentioned with respect to the money, the financial gain, keep in mind, Baker, as I said, not only did he plead guilty to the murder, to the conspiracy to commit murder, but he also pled guilty to the special circumstances of lying in wait, and he also pled guilty to the financial gain special circumstance. So, two special circumstances where he is lying in wait, that he admits to, as well as committing the murder for financial gain. So again, what does that mean, that Baker has now admitted to committing this murder for financial gain? I'm 100% certain that Baker is not one of the beneficiaries on any of Fabio Sementilli's life insurance policies or his beneficiary to any of his estate. So how is Baker going to get his hands on money? How does he derive a financial gain? The only way he derives a financial gain is through the defendant, because that tells you, again, they discussed this, because he's expecting the two of them are going to be spending their future together and that they're going to live off of Fabio's money. Okay? So, just as I talked about there being two different ways to get to first-degree murder, two different ways that you could get malice, aforethought. In this case, once you determine that you are talking about a first-degree murder, whether you get there by a lying-in-wait theory of first-degree murder, or whether you get there by a willful, deliberate, premeditated theory of first-degree murder, once you make a decision that this is a first-degree murder, only then do you move on to the special circumstances. If you find her not guilty, you don't got to worry about any of this stuff. Okay? But once you make a finding on the verdict forms that this is a first-degree murder, then you're going to be asked to determine not guilty or not guilty, as you do with the charges of murder and conspiracy, but true or not true as to the two special circumstance allegations in this case. There are two, as I just mentioned, one being, again, murder by means of lying in wait, and I'm going to go through the law and the special circumstance, and it's going to sound very similar to what we talked about in terms of the elements with respect to first-degree murder. And then murder for financial gain. Again, both special circumstances that Baker pled to, because we didn't give him anything. So if we're not giving him anything, he either pleads to the sheet or he goes to trial. And of course, as you heard in this case, why does he do that? And you heard about all of these complaints about, oh, his attorney didn't tell him this, and the judge didn't tell him that, and he didn't know what the evidence was, and so on and so forth. Keep in mind, the one thing he does say he knew about was the DNA evidence. And you hear he and the defendant talking to each other about the DNA evidence in the lockup overhears. And he talks about, it's just a few drops of DNA. What does that mean? Well, it depends. Depends if you have a DNA expert on the stand who's worth their salt, right? Another thing I just want to throw in here, when we talk about expert witnesses, because there were numerous experts that testified, and it's not, again, not in my closing, but every time I walk away from the podium, I think of something else. When you are talking about the evaluation of an expert, or whether you're talking about the opinions of an expert or even a non-expert, the most important thing to keep in mind is when someone expresses an opinion, again, I'll give you a perfect example. You want to look at the foundation, the basis of the opinion, right? Because if the basis of the opinion is solid, then you can build on it, right? Then you can say, well, if you have this, you follow the protocols. If you're talking about, let's say, a DNA expert, you're accredited, it makes you do things so that we can tell that the results you obtain are reliable and repeatable. That's the whole point of science, right? It has to be repeatable, it has to be reliable. It has to be something where someone else could come in, do the same work you did, and get the same result. The basis of the opinion has to be solid. Garbage in, garbage out, right? So let's, I'll segue over to her for a brief moment. Deborah Obad, right? Nancy Drew here. She's calling LAPD and she's telling them what to do, right? Like I said, detectives, they'll sit there all day long, they'll take in your information, but they're going to assess and they're going to do their own analysis and they're going to take in, but they're not going to give it out, right? They're going to play it close to the vest. They're not going to compromise anything. You have somebody like Deborah Obad who calls up and says, I think it's this person. I think it's that person. What is the basis of your opinion? Why do you think that? He's a short, boring Jew. Okay. So, again, what's the basis of your opinion? I think it's this guy because there's DNA connecting him to the crime. Okay? very different, right? It has to be solid. And again, whether we're talking about expert opinion or we're talking about what's referred to as lay opinion, someone who's not an expert, but they're going to say, I believe this is what it is based on X, Y, and Z. You have to have a foundation that is reliable in order to base your opinion. So also keep that in mind when you're looking at the evidence in this case. So let's talk about the two special circumstance allegations. As I told you, the two of them in this case is you have to have an intentional murder that's committed for financial gain. Well, we already talked about the fact that this is an intentional murder. I mean, this was a murder that was planned to the hilt, right? I mean, there is mountains and mountains of planning behavior that you heard about for weeks and weeks. So there's a plan to receive Fabio's money, whether it be from life insurance, whether it be from stock options, whether it be, you heard about pension plans, savings plans, benefits, all of this money that Fabio had accrued over the years in his career. Intentional murder for financial gain. The second one, intentional murder by means of lying in wait. All right, let's break them down. The lying in wait, special circumstance. First of all, you have to have an intentional murder. We've already talked about that. We know it's an express malice, intentional murder. It was very premeditated and deliberate and planned out. And it has to be by means of lying in wait. So here the law requires that there be a substantial period of waiting and watching, or watching and waiting for the opportune time to act. We talked about the period of watching and waiting when it came to the first degree theory of murder. Here, for the lying in wait special circumstance, the law requires that the period has to be substantial. And it talks about that the state of mind has to be equivalent, again, to premeditation and deliberation. Okay? Which we've talked about. And then, once again, there is concealment of purpose, as I mentioned before when we talked about the lying in wait theory of first-degree murder. Concealment by ambush or secret design, because again, Fabio is going to be ambushed, whether they planned it the night before at the strip mall while he's picking up food, or ambushed in his backyard by a secret design in order to take him by surprise. Now we know, based on just even the way the crime scene looks, that this was something Fabio never saw coming. Whether you look at the despicable videotape of her dancing and singing with Fabio in the weeks before the murder, or the crime scene itself, he was being set up, right? What do we know? What does the evidence show us that bears this out? We know from listening to the testimony of the chief medical examiner in this case that Fabio did not sustain any defensive wounds. Defensive wounds meaning to the hands, to the forearm area, because somebody who is trying to ward off an attack, human instinct is the first thing you do is you're going to put your hands up, right? So classic defensive wounds that you would expect. He doesn't even have the time to do that. He doesn't even have the opportunity. That's how fast this goes down. He is sitting outside. He's got his side to the door. He's facing towards his television over in the corner against that kitchen area, and they rush him, right? And Austin talks about how one of them he put his hands over Fabio's eyes so Fabio couldn't see where the knife attack is coming from. They put the hand over the mouth so he can't scream, so that the neighbors aren't alerted, and they stab him numerous times, and he goes down, right? He stands up at some point, obviously, because he's lying over the chair, right? He's got the handset for the home phone sitting on the chair that we see. His left wrist is hanging down with his Rolex watch, but he's got no defensive wounds. He had no time to defend himself. He would never have thought in a million years, he would never have fathomed that his wife of almost 20 years would conspire with her lover to murder him. So, again, take a look at the crime scene photos for that purpose in this case. I am not going to show you any autopsy photos. We went through that so that you could get an idea of the injuries that Fabio sustained. In this case, feel free to look at them again if you need to. In the back, you'll have all of the evidence available to you. One more thing I do want to say about the defense videos of the defendant and Fabio dancing and singing. Those videos may very well be proof of how much Fabio adored his wife. And that was testified to by several witnesses. But all it shows on behalf of the defendant is how well she was able to fool her own family, including her daughters and her husband, into believing that she was a loving, devoted wife, which she clearly was not. Another piece of evidence that backfired. Now, the financial gain special circumstance. You were told by the defense that there was no financial motive for the defendant to kill her husband. Now, in this case, there are at least two different motives that I'm going to talk about today. One, I've already spoken about, and that was the defendant's plan to be with her lover, Robert Baker. The second being the money. We heard a lot about the money. And by obtaining Fabio's money, that would give them the basis to be able to marry, if they so chose, to travel, to fund their lifestyle, to buy houses, property, whatever else they talked about. So I'm going to spend the next several minutes talking about money and the financial gain special circumstance. Some of it is very dry. You heard various experts testify in this case, but I'm going to bring it down to a very simple concept. There's no life insurance without death. This was an intentional murder. It was carried out for financial gain. Baker admitted to that. The defendant believed that her husband's death would result in this financial gain. Now, when Judge Cohen reads you this instruction, probably at some point tomorrow, if not Monday, these are the elements of the financial gain special circumstance. Part of that instruction also reads that the defendant need not actually receive any financial benefit. It's the expectation of the gain. In other words, the motive for the murder that is the key. In this case, we know she did get a significant amount of money. The thing that was held back, if you recall, was the life insurance. Remember that. There was other monies that were paid out, and I'm going to talk about some of that. So again, whether or not the defendant actually received the life insurance is irrelevant. It's the expectation by committing the murder that she's going to be able to receive some financial gain. And it doesn't say, notice, oh, it has to be more than X amount. It could be $1, right? We know in this case, it was substantial. Also, this instruction tells you that financial gain does not need to be the primary or the sole motive for the murder. So as I said, the fact that this murder is committed not just for money, but also so that she can live her future with her true soulmate, Robert Baker, that is okay. It doesn't have to be your primary or your sole motive. So what type of evidence do we have in this case that proves, again, I always like to come back and tie it back to the evidence. What evidence do we have? Well, first of all, the very night of Fabio's murder, the defendant begins talking about and inquiring about the money. Remember the testimony from Fabio's boss, Sal Mocheri, the CEO of Wella at the time. Remember that after he gets word that Fabio has been killed, he takes some of his top execs with him. Takes Henry Meyer, head of HR. He takes Dave Diaz, who was previously Fab's boss up in Canada when he was working for P&G. And remember Dave Diaz and Ruben Carranza, we'll talk about that. Before Fabio even accepts this position with Wella that then it gets bought out a couple of times, Dave Diaz and Ruben Carranza take not just Fabio, but the defendant out with Fabio for dinner. And they talk about financial benefits and why this is a good move for somebody who is running hair salons in Canada and is a top hair platform artist with his sister Morella. And so remember, Sal says he goes out to the scene, he brings his people with him, they get eyes on Monica, they go back to the office, and these people are devastated, right? And they rally and they get together and they say, what can we do to support Monica and the kids for Fabio? What are we going to do, right? And what does he tell you? He tells you that he then starts receiving text messages from Deborah Obad. And I think at this point I probably don't have to explain to you why you could picture that happening in your own head, why someone would be that presumptuous, right? And she's texting, by the way, just so that you know, she has somehow Sal Mocheri's cell phone number. He's the CEO, right, of Wella. And she's texting him, can you guys figure out his life insurance? This is within hours of Fabio being stabbed to death. Monica is asking. She said it all changed with Cody. It's different. She means Cody, C-O-T-Y. And although she thinks she's that smart, she's not that smart. And I'll tell you why in a minute. And so what does Sal tell you? And I know it's been a while since you remember Sal testifying, but Sal says she was so presumptuous, she was so forward, obnoxious would be my word, that he shows these messages, remember? He goes and shows them to Henry, and he's like, what is up with this? And he responds very professionally. He says, best scenario is for Henry, because Henry we know is the HR director for Wella, and someone from his family, meaning not you, we're not going to talk to you, kind of like law enforcement, about Fab's money, someone from his family to have a discussion. Like, not your place, lady. Can you have someone call Henry tomorrow afternoon? Sure, who? Monica cannot talk. Yeah, well, you heard what happened from there. So remember that these text messages from Obad continue onto Sal's phone into the early morning hours of the next day, saying the defendant wants to know about the life insurance. And Sal testified that he thought it was bizarre at the time because, as he said, and as you saw from him and various other individuals that came in and testified from the company, he thought it was bizarre because it wouldn't be anybody's main concern at that point. We're talking about somebody who was just brutally murdered. And he thought it was highly inappropriate. And so Sal then tells you that he was aware after the fact of that night that Henry was putting together a set of documents for the defendant with all the contact information in order to be able to reach out to all of the individuals, because remember, before Fabio comes to the U.S., he's working for, he's a platform artist, an independent contractor along with Morella for P&G and Wella up in Canada, and so he had benefits even from the company in Canada. And so all of this is being put together with the appropriate individuals of who to contact to access all of the information. And what Sal testified is over the course of the next several weeks and months that he was made aware as the CEO that the defendant was harassing and pressuring Henry and his staff about the life insurance payout. And you heard from every single person that testified that these individuals at Wella did everything and anything that they could to try and make the defendant happy, and that they sent her claim to Tracy Rakovich, who was the HR benefits person for Cody, for the entire company out of New York, the New York headquarters. And that claim was submitted to MetLife, who the company contracted with in order to provide benefits and life insurance to their employees. And yet, even though it was out of Wella's hands, the defendant continued to harass Henry at that point, despite it being explained to her numerous times that the claim was now within the hands of the insurance company that doesn't work for Wella. They're a separate company. Then you heard from Sam Pulera. If you remember Sam, he's somebody who knew Fabio. He was a hairdresser himself. He worked at salons like Fabio did. He was also working for P&G and Wella, and Fob brought him into the company when he came. Like I said earlier today, Fob was one of those guys who wanted to take everybody up with him on his way up, and gave him a position. And Sam looked up to Fabio, he looked up to Monica, and despite the fact that the defense tried to spin the story that the defendant was unaware, even the divorce lawyer that was name-dropping all of his clients made some comment about her being unaware of what the policies and benefits were. We know that is a completely false story based on the evidence. Again, always coming back to the evidence, not speculation, evidence. There has to be a basis for opinion. So what we learned from Sam Pulera was that the defendant, as well as Fabio, had told him numerous times, including when they had a going away party. Remember that? For Fabio, before he left Toronto to move to the United States, there was a going away party up in Canada, and Sam was talking to Fabio and to Monica about the benefits and things like that Fob was going to get by coming to this company and leaving the country. And in front of the defendant, Fabio told him he gives all of the financials, all the financial documents go to Monica for her to handle, and they talked about things like life insurance and profit sharing and stock. And the defendant boasted about how she handles all of the family finances. Now, we also heard that same story from Morella, who talked about the fact that when Fabio got married to the defendant and they opened up Salon Fabio in Canada, that the defendant was the one who handled the books. Fabio obviously handled the clients, but the defendant was the one who was handling the family's finances. And we also heard some information from Robert Baker, which Ron Ray said he realized some of it was only half true, that Baker's girlfriend was, remember, a professor, and it turned out she taught classes in salon management up in Canada. So again, the same type of thing that we heard from various people. She's the one that's handling the family's finances. Fabio's making the money. And of course, there were numerous statements the defendant made that demonstrated her knowledge of what assets Fabio had, including, as we talked about, the life insurance, the stock options at that going away party, and that she told Sam Pulera at that time, before they even moved to the United States, that she was convinced. She was convinced that they should make this move to the United States because of the great financial benefits, and that's what Sam testified about. And then again, you heard that once Fabio brought Sam on board into the company, that Fabio's team, year after year, kept winning these things that the company called Trendsetter Award trips, where they would send you and your spouse or your significant other on these trips to Hawaii, Maui, various places. And on one of those trips in 2011, Sam Pulera and his wife were lucky enough on Fab's team to go on one of these trips with Fabio and Monica to Hawaii, where they had lunch together one day, and she basically proved her knowledge to Sam because she was telling him how he's got to buy into the stock options and all these other retirement plans because when you wait, they increase in value. Common sense. And so we heard a bunch of talk in this trial about, well, how did she know what they were worth then and what were they worth now? And anyway, back and forth. The bottom line is she knew that if she left that there, these stock options are going to increase in value. And so what you heard was exactly what she said to Sam Pulera. They may have only been worth $74,000, $75,000, $78,000 in 2017, but right now, they're worth a ton of money, right? And we heard about that from Marie Ebersbacher, and we're also going to talk a little bit about Mr. Rubin, who came back again yesterday. But again, this is what the defendant was encouraging Sam to do, invest in this stuff, because over time, as the company has more success, so will the stock, and therefore your shares will increase in value. And so that was...
Again, that just misstates the testimony.
For the same reason I told the jury relating to their memory of the testimony, the objections overruled.
Thank you.
Again, for the same reason, the defendant, and I'm only just getting started with the money, the defendant on numerous occasions demonstrated her knowledge of what Fabio's assets were and how it worked through numerous pieces of evidence, including when the defendant talked about the fact that the life insurance, she told Sam Pulera, was amazing. The stock options get better and better as the years go on, she told him at lunch in Hawaii. And in 2011, everybody laughed about it. But it became much less funny in January of 2017 when Sam recalled that at that lunch, the defendant told Sam and his wife, "Fabio's worth more dead to me than alive." All right, let's move on. As I mentioned earlier, we heard from Dave Diaz. He was the boss, Fabio's boss, when Fab worked for Wella as a platform artist. He and Ruben Carranza, who was the CEO before Sal Mocheri, took the defendant Fabi out to dinner in 2010 in Toronto in order to discuss the opportunity, as he put it, to grow wealth by coming to work as an executive for Wella. And Dave said that at that dinner, his job was to get Monica on board, and so he told her about the benefits the company offered, such as things like life insurance and stock options and things of that nature. He also testified that after the murder, he went to see the defendant over at the residence, the Sementilli residence on Queen Victoria, a couple of times. And he described some of this bizarre demeanor where she acted distraught, but yet she was shedding no tears. And she kept telling him and everybody else that she didn't know how they would survive financially. And remember this? And this is the same story she gave to law enforcement initially on January 23rd after the murder, which quickly changed. She knew nothing about Fabio's benefits. And we know that was 100% a lie. How do we know that other than through numerous witnesses? We know because we presented exhibits where Fabio sent emails, just as he and the defendant talked about with Sam Pulera and others, emails of his benefit selections, including the percentages. And you heard from Alicia Truesdale, Fabio's executive assistant, about the fact that in 2016, Fabio was increasing the amount that he was taking out of his paycheck and putting into these policies because she knew that he wanted to make sure that his family was secure. And so, again, although she's telling people like Dave Diaz and Henry and law enforcement on the night of January 23rd and in the days thereafter that she knew nothing about Fab's benefits, we know that all of that was false. And we also heard that Dave Diaz was present at the house because he went there a couple of times on the day that he and Henry went back to the house and sat on the couch with the defendant, and Henry gave the defendant the set of documents that we've also marked as exhibits and put in, listing all of Fabio's assets, including the stock options, the savings plans, the retirement programs, the life insurance, both from the United States and from Canada. We heard from Henry. You remember, he's the gentleman who was the senior HR director for Coty North America, and you heard that he tried his best to help the defendant by preparing all of these documents for her with the contact information for the various assets. And he also said that he did a significant amount of research so that he could determine not only what Fabio had in the United States, but also what Fabio had before Wella was bought out by Coty when they were under the P&G umbrella in Canada. And so he actually sat down and went over all of these assets with the defendant in the days following the murder. And if you recall, again, these are some of the exhibits or portions of the exhibits. You can look under exhibits 102 and 103, but there's numerous financial documents that we put in to support it. And if you recall, he talked about Fabio's life insurance, he talked about Fabio's 401k, and I noticed that on the document that he prepared, he put in what he estimated the value at, and as you heard later, once we subpoenaed documentation from Mr. Rubin, the estate co-administrator, that he complained about because it took so much time to put the documents together. Those documents then were provided to Marie Ebersbacher, who's a forensic accountant in the family law arena, who divorce lawyers hire for these high-priced divorces. This wasn't one of those. This was not as complicated as the cases that she handles. As she talked about, the estate was relatively small. However, what we learned was that Henry underestimated the value of some of these assets, such as the 401k. The documentation shows it was approximately $30,000. The profit share and savings plans, which were $43,600. Fabio also had an international stock ownership plan through P&G through Canada. They referred to that as an ISOP. There was a 401k savings plan through Cody. He had restricted stock units, and Henry put together documentation on all of these assets, and he talked about how he spent all this time researching so that he could get everything together for her in one place. So when he met with her 3 days later on January 26th, he was able to provide that to her. And again, during that meeting where Dave Diaz was present, she claimed she didn't know about any of Fabio's benefits, and also told him that Fabio handled all the family finances, which we know is the exact opposite of what she told Sam Pulera and others. And she even went so far as to tell Henry that Fabio kept all of his benefits from her, which was also a lie given the emails that we found in her email accounts that we subpoenaed from his 2017 benefits enrollment, both in May and in October of 2016. And those are in the neighborhood of exhibits 96 and 97. Henry also provided contact information, as I said, regarding the ISOP. That was a Canadian pension that was worth approximately $61,000. He called as well to P&G in Cincinnati as well as Canada, and he said that he did that for Monica to notify them about Fabio's death so they could start the process of the payout to the defendant for these various assets.
Let's take our afternoon recess for 15 minutes. The admonition applies. See you back here.
So, as I was saying, Henry also talked about the fact that there were various financial benefits that were provided to the defendant in addition to what we've seen in the documentation, and that included things, as you recall, they paid for Fabio's executive salary for 6 months, so a little over $100,000. Obviously, though, that's gross, so that doesn't, once the taxes come out, we saw that that was a different amount when Marie Ebersbacher created her chart. He also made sure that she received the value of Fabio's accrued vacation. The company wrote off his, as I talked about earlier, the $9,000 car loan. They paid, as you heard, to transfer or repatriate Fabio's body back to Canada. They paid for food and transportation for both the defendant's family and Fabio's family, who all had to fly in from Canada. They paid for the local funeral service on January 29th for the wake that occurred at the home after that night, and I think he testified came to somewhere around 9 to 10 grand. But the other thing that he mentioned, which was interesting, that he brought up, was that when he went to the home to explain all of Fabio's benefits, whether that was January 26th or when he went again on February 9th, the defendant had her estate lawyer there with her. And that Henry told the defendant in front of the lawyer that in order to get the insurance money, she was going to need to be cleared by law enforcement. The insurance company was going to require that before the insurance company would pay out. And yet, despite all of Henry's efforts and the work that he did to help her out, by March, the defendant began falsely complaining about him to other employees at the company. And he talked about how the defendant became very aggressive, that she hassled him, I think was his word, and harassed him about things like the life insurance payout that he had no control over. And as you recall, he said that he had no less than 4 conversations with her where he explained to her that that wasn't something he had control over. And again, keep in mind, whether we're talking about Henry or Dave Diaz or Sal or Sam or any of these individuals from the company, they were all aware of those Instagram posts that the defendant would put out, those public Instagram posts, which I spent some time in my opening statement, and you have copies of those in evidence as well. I believe those came in through Officer Curtis Davis, that the defendant, as I said, I used them as evidence to show you this double life, where on the public side of things, the defendant was posting about how much she missed Fabio and that she's just devastated, and that was the public persona or perception that she was putting out, that all of these people from the company were watching, and how it made them feel so empathetic and sorry and devastated for her, such that they were willing to do anything just to try to help her because they felt so bad. And yet none of them knew that behind the scenes she had this other life where she's, as we heard about yesterday, running over to Baker's house and performing oral sex or and taking photos of it. You know, it's one thing if you were to go and have your affair, right? It's another when you are photographing it. And again, you have to remember the conversations the defendant and Baker had in the lockup, where she talked about how she was so afraid that law enforcement was going to get into her phone. And if they cracked her phone, what would they find? And again, we're not just talking about the fact that her iPhone was 119, her phone number 42442, up to her iCloud, but then again, there's all these very provocative photographs that show her in various positions, which is why we were able to take that and juxtapose it with the calendar of events that were taking place and be able to show you that we're really talking about somebody who's very devious and who's trying to display a different persona to everybody else than what's real, what's really taking place. And so, despite the fact that Henry was very empathetic and wanting to give her everything he could, he was then contacted numerous times by her lawyer, who wanted him again to speed up this insurance payout, that once again Henry said, out of my hands, we have no control. And we know that it had already been processed, this claim, by Tracy Rakovich, because we heard from her as well. So regardless of how they characterize it and what experts are called, right now, as I told you during the opening, she stands to inherit over $2 million in assets. And maybe to some people that might not seem like a lot of money, but it is a lot of money. And if she walks out the door, that's what she'll get to inherit, because that's what the value is now of the stock options, the life insurance, and some of these other things that have been waiting, such as the house, for instance. When the house was sold, they had to pay off the mortgage. She got half. The other half goes into Fabio's estate. Well, if she gets off, she gets the other half. As Marie was trying to explain to you in very simple terms, when you're looking at, just for an example, divorce was brought up, just to give you an idea of the difference between these things. In a divorce, you're maybe looking at, it's not necessarily 50% of every asset, but maybe 50. It could be something less, but there's negotiation that takes place. But it's not 100%. You only get 100% if he's gone, right? Last time I checked, 100% still better than 50%? Again, common sense. And I talked about the fact that she knew the value of these assets because she's the one who handled the family's assets, handled the finances. And then we heard from Janet Cover, and if you recall, Janet was also a person who worked for HR under Henry at Wella, and she also went to the residence a couple times to go over Fabio's benefits once again with the defendant. And there's a document, Exhibit 175, that she testified about, and that when she went over there to go through the benefits with the defendant and to assist her with the information so the defendant could contact some of the people that Henry had laid out for her. Instead, what happened was the defendant, if you recall, went out onto the patio to smoke a cigarette and talk on her phone, and Janet made the calls on her behalf to P&G in order to trigger the exercise of stock options, and to P&G Canada for Fob's additional stock and benefits. And then, if you recall, after that, the defendant then confirmed with Janet in the days thereafter via a text message exchange that she did. The defendant did get a call back from P&G, and Janet told you that the defendant would then call her every couple of days to check in on the status of the life insurance payout, and repeatedly again mentioned to her that she had a lawyer to try and pressure these people who had no control. And then, as you heard from Janet, if you remember this, the defendant even sent her, and you can look at the text messages yourself between the defendant and Janet. She sends to Janet Detective Parshall's phone number, as if Janet should call Detective Parshall. So then we heard that on April 12th, the defendant texts Janet about the life insurance and the stock options. Remember when there was this claim that she didn't know about the stock options? She texts Janet specifically about the life insurance and stock options going to probate because Fabio died without a will. And that was Defense Exhibit 616. And then again, you heard the same thing from Janet, that the defendant would call repeatedly to complain after Janet made calls for the defendant. One of the things that we put into evidence in this case, we laid the foundation for it. There was a stipulation. When you have a stipulation, the judge is going to instruct you that that means that you're to take whatever information is in the stipulation is true. In other words, an agreement between the parties. It's not contested. You can assume it's been proven, and you can use that evidence for whatever purpose. In this case, we did not play, even though we put in, they're very short, they are audio files of the defendant's messages and calls to P&G regarding the stock options and the life insurance. And we also have, as we do for every audio, we have transcripts of that. And that is Exhibits 237 through 242. Again, they were not played in court, but you should look at those when you go back into the deliberation room because we did not play them in open court. They're very short, but we wanted you to know that she made calls herself on top of all the calls that all these other individuals made. So then we heard from Fabio's son, Luigi Sementilli. And what he testified to was that he didn't even know his dad had a life insurance policy for him until the night that he gets a call saying that his father has just been murdered. And he testified that the first thing the defendant told him wasn't, "I'm so sorry, we're so devastated." It wasn't any of that. It was, "There's a significant amount of money coming your way." It was about money from minute one. That there was a significant amount of money coming to him from from Fabio's life insurance policy. And this was, recall, within 1 to 2 hours of Fabio's murder. Luigi said he was in complete shock. He was at that point in Canada attending school. You heard that he completed a master's program. He was in complete shock, but it was the only topic his stepmother talked about that night. And then he said that at some point, Deborah Obad gets on the phone with him, and he can hear the defendant talking and telling Obad what to say in the background. And Obad says, Monica's saying there's money problems. And Obad tells Luigi that she's assured Monica, "Don't worry, Luigi will be willing to give up some of his money to give to you and the girls." And she's telling Luigi this as if she's making the decisions for Fabio's son. And as Luigi said, he found that to be kind of like what Sal Boccieri said, extremely presumptuous. It was inappropriate given the timing, but he was in shock. And then you heard 2 days later, Fabio's family on January 25th, which would be Wednesday, 2017, flies out to California, and the defendant gives Luigi the Rolex watch, and she asks Luigi to come upstairs with her. And as you recall from the photos of the second floor of the house, that's where Jessica's bedroom was. There's a bathroom up there. There's a big open living room area, and in the back of that living room area next to the window sits this desk that the defendant had along with her desktop, which we seized after the arrest on June 14th, 2017. And so he goes upstairs with her to the computer, and she shows him a spreadsheet that she has with a breakdown of the life insurance proceeds. This is now 2 days later. And he noted from the breakdown, at least, that she provided, that she was getting the most money, contrary to what the defense has told you, and that during that week that he's there, he has numerous conversations with the defendant where she brings up the topic of money. And then you also heard, once he returns to Canada, the defendant continued to send him versions of that spreadsheet that she was constantly updating and editing, as we saw in Exhibit 75, where there would be columns that are blank, and then as she is learning about various assets, she fills in those portions, and then she calls and tells him. And then recall, there is a text string between the defendant and Luigi that takes place. It's Exhibit 77 through 81. And she talks about the life insurance, and she uses the language saying, life insurance, big numbers, unbelievable. And then she tells him to do what? Delete the text. Once I send you the number, delete the text. Because why would anybody be talking about the money this way, in such a cavalier fashion? And of course, you heard that once we got those text messages from the phone, it showed exactly what he testified to. And you also heard that up to that point, the defendant until the time from the murder until the time of the arrest, she didn't want anybody from her family or Fabio's family contacting law enforcement. She got very upset about that, and Deborah said she was mad that I did that, and obviously we know why. But Luigi finally talks to law enforcement the day after the arrest, if you recall, on June 15th, and he tells the detectives about all of this information that he's now testified to here. And the family, who were so wanting to support Monica and the girls and to try and help her, now are learning about some of the evidence as well as the affair, and they feel betrayed, as anybody, rightly so, would feel. How else would one feel? And so they're attacked for that. They're attacked for the fact that they helped, and they're attacked for the fact that they feel betrayed. And so you heard, and it was testified to, and I'm not going to get into it too much because some of it is a tragedy and it's beyond anything we can control, but this murder literally rips these two families who for all of these years had been so close apart. And Fabio's family is left to grieve on their own, and to their way of thinking, his daughters are acting disrespectfully towards Fabio in his memory, backing up their mother, hiding their heads, so to speak, in the sand, and as Deborah Obad said, they're all in denial. And so, again, as I mentioned earlier about the actions of this defendant and how it destroyed so many lives, when you think of, for example, if you were to throw a pebble into, let's say, a pond, that ripple effect, right? And it impacts so many people. Whether it's intended or unintended, it doesn't really matter, but you literally rip apart these relationships that have been built on trust over the course of so many years. And so that's where we are. And so you heard that in the aftermath of this murder, Luigi, again, who's following the defendant's Instagram posts, he feels horrible for Monica, his stepmom, and they'd never really been very close, but now he said he reached out to her a lot. He would call her and check on her, and he would check on his sisters. And you heard that the defendant comes to Toronto a couple of times for various events, and she comes to Toronto for the end of February, around the 28th of February, for the 1-month anniversary service of Fabio's death. And he goes over to Monica's mother's house to see Monica, and she tells him that she's going to be liquidating these stock options, and she claimed at that time that they were worth more than $100,000. He doesn't know anything about the stock options, and she asks him again if he'll relinquish his portion, that at that point she said was approximately $30,000, because he had this, bless you, this Manulife policy under Canadian law. When you divorce in Canada, you're required to have support for your children. And so that was the policy that Monica had referred to, that Fabio had put into place for Luigi. And you remember Luigi talked about how the defendant, just like everyone else testified to, she constantly complained about the money problem to him over the next several months, and how she was struggling with bills. And so he agreed, because he thought his mom, his stepmom, and his sisters were struggling, but the defendant never followed through. And of course, as we know, and I've talked about, she knows that the longer she leaves those options without exercising them, as long as she can, if until they're ready to expire, they'll be worth more money. And that he felt, heartbroken for his entire family. But you also heard him talk about the fact that after his mother and Fabio divorced when he was young, he would spend weekends and various time in between the two households, and that it was very clear to him growing up that when he was in his father's house, that Monica was the boss, that she was in charge of the family's finances. She, not Fabio, was the one who reached out to Luigi's mom, Wanda, to talk about the payment of Luigi's school tuition. It wasn't Fabio who did that. Monica took that on herself because she is the one that handled the family finances. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we heard from Tracy Rakovich, who came in from New York, who was the benefits manager for the company, for the U.S. operations for Cody. And she talked about how Cody purchased Wella and contracted, as I said, with MetLife to provide retirement benefits and life insurance, and that in 2016, Fabio had life insurance that was 6 times his salary, and that was in Exhibit 93. And she assisted Fabio with his 2017 benefits enrollment and the purchases of life insurance and supplemental accidental death and dismemberment coverage. These are contained in emails from Exhibit 92, and then the enrollment documents for 2017 in Exhibit 95, and that Fabio elected to purchase approximately $1.691 million in life insurance, where the defendant was the main beneficiary on each of those policies. When you look through it, you'll see that in certain categories, like the basic life insurance, 40%, and then other portions 45%, and then in other portions 50%, and the kids, as I mentioned, split the remaining portion. And so once Fabio did that, the defendant's share was $7,000, almost $800,000. That's the defendant's portion of the life insurance money, $800,000. And we also heard and saw that the defendant sent that Fabio sent his documents, just as he always said he did, to the defendant on May 17th of 2016 and October 4th of 2016. And those are Exhibits 96 and 97. And if you recall, Ms. Rakovich recognized those documents. We showed them to her as the same information, the same documents she provided to Fabio along with his selections. And so after the death, she was responsible for processing the defendant's life insurance claim. That was Exhibit 98. And once she made the claim to Fabio's policy, it triggered the payment process to all the beneficiaries. And you recall the constant questioning about what Luigi had done, and did he try to get the money? And Luigi kept saying, I never made any claim. They just sent me a check. And Tracy Rakovich says that's how it works. Tracy, when she makes the claim on Fabio's policy, it triggers the payout, and all of the beneficiaries that were cleared, meaning Luigi, who's in Canada, and his 2 sisters who are here, are paid out. But the defendant is not, because, again, we heard from a couple of detectives about that, and I'm going to get to that. One of them was Steve Castro. And so at that point, she was also made aware, as Sementilli was, that the defendant was constantly contacting Henry Meyer and Janet Cover about the delay in the payment process. But again, as she testified, payments were only made once clearance was provided by the law enforcement agency. So we also heard that various other individuals were involved in this evidence. We heard from Ernie Valorano, one of Fabio's close friends, that he became quite worried after Fabio's death because of the defendant claiming that she didn't know how she would even survive or buy groceries. And if you recall, he, like Sam Pulera, offered the defendant money. He wanted to help her because she was the widow of his best friend. And so he offered her a job. And he had no idea during that same time period, as Henry Meyer testified, he didn't really understand what the all the pressure was, because at that point in time she's getting Fabio's salary as if Fabio was alive. And when Ernie was asked by the defendant to get rid of, sell Fabio's Porsche, she took a lower offer, if you recall, to sell the Porsche in order to get the money faster. Instead of waiting, as Ernie said, he had another buyer who wanted to pay $15,000 more, but that individual was on vacation for a couple of weeks. But instead of getting additional money, $15,000 at that point, the defendant didn't want to wait, and so she told him to take the lower offer. And what we heard was, again, even more calls that were being made and more contacts that were being made with Wella about things that really might seem at this point to be obsessive. And we heard a little bit about that from Fabio's executive assistant, Alicia Truesdale, that the defendant even contacted her in the days after Fabio's murder because she wanted to obtain, if you recall this, Fabio's frequent flyer mileage. Because Fabio was an executive and was flying on the company dime, he, traveled significantly for business within the United States, also up to North America, Canada, and a couple times a year to Europe. And so he had acquired a significant amount of frequent flyer mileage, and Alicia, who was, again, felt so bad for the defendant, went about obtaining and transferring Fabio's frequent flyer mileage over to the defendant, even though the company paid for Monica to attend some of these events where Fabio received awards, such as the one was the Mirror Awards in Canada that we heard about in Toronto that year. And so we also heard, as I said, from Jim Duggan, the corporate security officer for Cody, who also flew out from New York. He contacted the defendant on March 9th, and he wanted to know, what can Cody do to help you? And she didn't ask for the things that he expected. She didn't ask, can you get me a new security system? She didn't ask, I want to move out of the house. Can you guys pay for moving costs so the girls and I can move to a place where we feel safe? She didn't even ask for corporate housing on a temporary basis. She didn't ask for any of that. The only thing she wanted from Jim Duggan was, can you help me get Fabio's life insurance? And so each time after that, the defendant contacted Mr. Duggan. The only topic she contacted him about was the life insurance money. Now, shortly after the murder, law enforcement learns that the defendant, again, is the single largest beneficiary of Fabio's life insurance policy. And Detective Steve Castro testified. He's now retired. He was the supervisor of the homicide division at Valley Bureau. He supervised Detective Parshall and Detective Verna. And you recall, he testified about receiving a call from Cody in March about Fabio's life insurance policy for the $1.6 million that Tracy Rakovich mentioned. And he instructed the insurance company not to release any of the money at that point until law enforcement had cleared the defendant, because at this point we're talking about March 20th, law enforcement is well aware of the relationship between the individual who left DNA at the crime scene in Fabio's Porsche and is having an illicit affair with the victim's wife. And so then, after he instructs the insurance company on March 20th of 2017 not to release the money to the defendant, 2 days later he gets a call from the defendant, and she leaves a voicemail message. And recall Detective Castro testified that the defendant on this voicemail message communicated how unhappy and upset she was and wants to know why her insurance money isn't being released, and she demands a call back. And remember what Detective Castro said? He said that in all the years that he had been working homicide or had been a supervisor in a homicide division, he had never received a message like that from a beneficiary before. And then we learn on June 1st of 2017, he is copied on an email from the defendant requesting that they accelerate her clearance for the life insurance claim. Now, that was marked as a people's exhibit. It was also marked as a defense exhibit, and we saw that happen several times during this trial, where the people would put in an exhibit, and a couple minutes later on cross-examination, they'd mark the very same exhibit. They'd indicate that it had additional information, and then they'd go through it, and it was exactly the same as the people's exhibit. So there is a defense exhibit 612 that mirrors the people's exhibit, and when you look at that email, if you recall, the letter that Marco Laurenti drafted for the defendant at Morella's request to help her out, to assist her in trying to get the life insurance money, that letter is exactly the same email the defendant sent to Detectives Parshall, Verna, and Detective Castro, and that's Exhibit 111. And that she claimed that it was urgent that she receive this money because she had no support for her and her girls. All right, I'm going to move on to a related topic. After the defendant flies, if you remember, at the beginning of June of 2017, on June 9th, she flies to New York City. She flies to New York City on June 9th for a graduation from medical school for one of Morella's children. She's there in New York City with Morella and Marco and some of the family, and you remember they go to like a cigar lounge and various other things. And when she lands on June 9th in New York, where the time is 3 hours ahead of what we are here in California, she receives an email that we heard about from Detective Gable, where Detective Gable and Detective Tellis from the robbery homicide division of LAPD, their elite homicide unit downtown, have now taken over this case. And Detective Gable and Detective Tellis are working with Detectives Verna and Parshall, and they are telling them, we want to do this next and stimulate this and see what the response is from that. And they're digging in now, and they're trying to get up to speed on this case. And so they, Detective Gable testifies, they tell Parshall to send this email to the defendant saying, we're going to clear you. We're ready to clear you. Secretary's typing it up. MetLife should have it by the end of next week or the following week. And she lands in New York, and we see on the email that and the defendant celebrate extraction. The email here is Exhibit 176. The minute that she lands, her phone switches obviously automatically over to New York time, so you'll see the 3-hour discrepancy between those two. What does she do? And we heard this right before that. There was all this cross-examination about, well, the defendant's worried about her daughters, and there's theatrics and yelling, and she's so concerned about her daughters. What about the daughters? And so you would expect that when the defendant gets this text message when she lands in New York, that the first thing she's going to do is what? What would common sense tell you? She's gonna call her daughters and say, "We're saved. We're gonna get the life insurance money." But she doesn't do that. Who's the first person that she tries to contact as soon as she opens her phone? And you can see it from the Celebrite extraction, because it'll show you, with respect to her phone, that she opens her email. The first person that she contacts, she calls Robert Baker. Now, if they weren't trying to get the life insurance money, and as Baker testified, he didn't know anything about any life insurance money, why would she be calling Robert Baker? She calls him, he doesn't pick up, so she messages him. She doesn't message her daughters, who the defense claims she was so concerned about. She doesn't message her sister, who's her best friend. She calls and messages Robert Baker, her lover, the person who she engaged in a conspiracy with to murder Fabio, her husband, so she could get her hands on the life insurance and other assets, as I said several times today, to fund their life together. So again, it's not a complete coincidence that he's the first person she thinks to share the good news with. After all, as we've heard, he is the most important person of all to her. And I'm going to tell you why I say that in a couple minutes.
Well, actually, we'll be doing that a little bit longer.
All right.
Let me interrupt you. We're going to take our adjournment now until tomorrow at 9 a.m. The admonition applies not to discuss this case among yourselves with anyone else or express any opinions of the cause that's finally submitted to you. Have a good evening. See you tomorrow at 9.